Welcome to Baer With Me, a mini-series of the Baer Faxt podcast. I'm your host and executive producer, Luyang Jiang. Today, we're launching a 3-part special edition to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Baer Faxt. In this series, I'm joined by my business partner and dear friend, Josh Baer, the founder and CEO of the Baer Faxt. Together, we'll be reflecting on the past 3 decades, the ideas, the stories, and the milestones that have shaped the Baer Faxt into what it is today. To those in the art world, the Baer Faxt has long been an iconic name for exclusive access and insightful knowledge. Since Josh founded the company in 1994 and has sent out that first newsletter through a fax machine. And for those too young to remember what a fax machine is, don't worry, we'll explain later. The art world has been reading the Baer Faxt weekly newsletter every Thursday morning at 9 a.m. New York time. For those who follow the art world's big auctions, reading Josh's reports straight from the auction rooms with details of who bought what and who bid on what but didn't win has become a ritual. In this first episode, we're going back to the beginning. How did Josh come up with the idea of sharing exclusive artwork information through a weekly newsletter? What was the artwork like back then? And how did a simple thought turn into something that's now an essential part of the art market? Let's dive right in. So, Josh, let's begin with the big question. How does it feel to be running a 30-year-old company?
Well, at least it's not half my life since I'm older than 60, but it feels like quite a bit of my life to have been doing the Baer Faxt for 30 years. It's kind of shocking how much it's become part of the art market and the art world. I didn't expect that 30 years ago.
So let's go back to 30 years ago. How did you start this idea?
Well, 30 years ago, I just closed my gallery. So I'd spent 10 years working with artists. And before that, I'd published a magazine and all sorts of things. And I suppose on one hand, I needed to figure out a new phase of my life. I think a lot of ideas, you don't really know where they came from. They're like in the shower or walking down the street. I don't know where it came from, but it popped into my head. Originally, the Baer Faxt, I went to Jerry's restaurant, which was the sort of commissary space in Soho where important dealers, unimportant dealers, important collectors, unimportant collectors, everybody went there for lunch. And I met with this guy who was a prominent art critic at the time, writing for the Village Voice at the time. So I met a guy named Jerry at a place called Jerry's, and that was Jerry Saltz. And I said, I have this idea. And he says, that's a good idea. I said, well, I'd like you to write it because you're a writer. He says, that's a bad idea. Why don't you do it yourself? And I went, do I have to? He said, yeah, that's a good idea. So that was sort of summer 1994. And the basis of it was information was really slow to the art business. Any news that was fresh, if it wasn't in Carol Vogel's column that week, it wasn't coming out for 2 months until Art in America or somebody like that published it. And I realized that people did like new news fast. And then I said, well, what's the technology? And it's like, wow, we have this new machine for a while called a fax machine. That's kind of like when that rings, everybody jumps up and runs to the fax machine to see what it is always. It's like, that's the most exciting sound in an art gallery for a couple of years was the beep of the fax. And so I said, why don't I make it like that? And then I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. So I went to my favorite art magazine called Art and Auction. And my favorite guy there, the owner of Art and Auction was a woman named Maureen Kogan. And she and her husband were major collectors and patrons. And I said, I have this idea. She said, that's a good idea. I'll give you like a little bit of money. Let's do it together. So the original plan was to make it part of Art and Auction. And then the publisher at Art and Auction hated it and did everything possible to undermine it. So it's like, okay, I'll do it myself. And I guess the rest is like 30 years of my life.
You mentioned a couple of times the idea. I have an idea. How did you introduce that idea to whether Jerry or the people you talk to?
Well, the idea was, how do I know something before the other guy? So the idea is like, I'm an art collector and I'm at dinner and I say to the people around the room, oh, do you know who the new architect is for MoMA? And they all go, no. And you're able to say, well, I know, it's so-and-so. And they go, how'd you know that? And it's like, there was a little bit of, I wouldn't say prestige, but the art world does deal with knowledge, and having knowledge sooner is valuable. And I thought, okay, those people would like to know, hey, I know that Larry Gagosian signed up Ed Ruscha from Castelli. How'd you know that? That flow of information soon was of interest to the people that I'd already dealt with for 10 years as my clients.
So to our younger listeners, the time when Josh was describing, this is a time that there was no Instagram, no TikTok, no other social media.
There wasn't even the internet. You're talking things from now. I mean, get more basic. The internet, I mean, technically existed, but it didn't really exist. There wasn't Google. You could look anything up. So that was why there was me standing there with the fax machine, feeding this thing off one by one to people around the world.
Lots of people ask why or how the Baer Faxt, the name came from.
Well, fax.
I mean, you already mentioned that fax machine.
It's a play on words about a fact. So something that's true. So our younger listeners don't even probably know what a fax machine is. In fact, I don't even have one anymore.
Do you still have your first fax machine, which you send your first edition newsletter?
It's at the Smithsonian. It's in a special display under the Baer Faxt, the original fax machine, and the fax machine emoji that we invented too. So those are both at the National Archives.
I think that the machine might be worth something if we ever put up an auction, which I don't think it's going to happen, right?
Well, the first like Mac, I think went for millions or something like that. So we'll see about that. Yes, for my retirement fund.
And many people in the art world get to know about you, not only just the weekly newsletter, but also from the auctions. Since when did you start an auction? And when you started doing that, what was the art world look like back then?
In 95, I started covering the auctions. Probably like everything I tend to do, it's like if I'm curious or I think I'd want to know, I assume other people would want to know. So that's how I do everything by gut instinct. So I thought, well, I'm interested in what's going on in the auctions. Obviously, they were much smaller. You're just emerging from being to the trade, which they were for hundreds of years, to having a bit of theater, and the collectors would want to go. The actual idea that I came up with, and again, I don't know which sour I was in or walking down the street. Actually, the key idea about our auction information, who bought something, is, which other people would occasionally write in the New York Times, like would say, Eli Broad bought this Liechtenstein for $1.2 million or something. So there was a column called Inside Art by Carol Vogel. That was the only competition. And she would have some news. And somehow I had this idea that not only was important that Eli Broad may have bought it, but what was important was maybe that Lawrence Luyang underbid it. And that's actually the most important single decision in the history of the Baer Faxt as a business that I ever came up with. Not so much to do the auction information, which is our most popular thing, but to publish the underbidders of the auction. And that's probably the single most valuable thing to the business in 30 years that I came up with. And I have no idea why I did it.
People in the art world, they all know about the brand. Why do you think there's no second Baer Faxt exist? Just, tell us a little bit more along the way. How was your business changing? How did you come up with those ideas and then to grow your business?
The fundamental fact of the Baer Faxt which was originally just me. So it's a little bit more complicated now with the team, was the fact that I'm not a journalist. So everybody else writing about the art business was a journalist. And journalism is great, but I was a dealer and an advisor. I was in the business. I understood the business. So when I was creating products, I thought, what would I want to have if I was still in my gallery? Or what do my collectors want? Because I deal with them. Journalists don't deal with collectors. I dealt with artists. I dealt with collectors. I dealt with other dealers. So the fundamental fact is that it wasn't even a media company at that point. It was just a newsletter. Is that what Judd Tully did or Carol Vogel did or anybody else did was fundamentally different. And it's still the case. No one else is covering the market from the vantage point of being in the market. Now, that's a challenge 30 years later. It's a personal challenge to the future of the Baer Faxt, because how do we separate the brand, the Baer Faxt, and me? But the other part of it is like, that's kind of interesting. There's a conflict of interest. It's like yesterday I was over at the auctions and like I saw somebody there and I know they don't want me to write and say who I saw because I was in there as an art advisor. Now, if I was a journalist, I'd be like calling page 6 or something, but I'm not. So am I there at, one of the big threes working as the Baer Faxt? Yes. But if I'm working there for like my advisory business, yes. So that's an inherent conflict of interest. And I argue, first of all, it's transparent to people. I bet there's a lot of journalists who are full of conflicts of interest and don't tell you. Writing a catalog essay, they wrote for the auction catalog, whatever they're doing. So they might have conflicts that aren't obvious. Ours are like right out there. So I often say to myself, it's like, you have to think about whether that is a weakness or a strength. And I think that's a strength.
I want to go back to what you just said about the conflict interest. Before I met you in person, when I was working in the auction house, that was one of the biggest questions every time when I read your newsletter. And as you said, you're not a journalist. You don't define the company, the Baer Faxt, as a media company. And you deal with art. You're an art advisor. You advise your clients buying and selling art. Where do you draw the line, including the case that you just mentioned earlier? How do you decide to include the name or not include, to disclose or not disclose?
Well, there's two factors. So there are people I have relationships with, and I know they don't want their name there. And I respect them. So I know a couple of people in the audience that maybe they were clients of mine, or they asked specifically, please don't do that. On the other hand, a lot of people want their news in the auction, they come to us. So during COVID, when the sales, no one was in the room, and a Rocher sold for $20 million. So this is, I think, June 2020. And the art market was, oh my God, are we going out of business? I immediately got a call from Larry Gagosian saying, I bought the Rocher for $20 million. He wanted me to publish that. And he understood our voice and the confidence that that put in the market. So that conflict is sometimes works to our advantage, that the relationship that I have there. And the difference, I think, is if you're a journalist and you get a story, it's a good one, and somebody doesn't want you to do it. If you're really good, you're like, you're going to do it. And you're not going to be, well, I'll get you next time around, because next time around usually doesn't happen. So a real journalist plays that game. I'm sometimes playing a little bit of a long game. That's like, okay, well, that guy is my advertiser. And that guy is somebody who I'm dealing with in other ways. So I have to be wise about it. And by doing that for a long time, I've built up trust in collectors and artists and galleries that then reward that with the information that won't go elsewhere. So that next story, the next time it comes back for us. And it's an intuitive thing that I just have to know when and where to like pull the trigger. And by the way, meeting me for the first time, I'm much taller than you expected, right? And better looking.
If we wanted to talk about our first meeting, I think that takes another episode of Baer With Me, which I'm planning to do in the future. I will save that for the next time.
Okay.
I mean, you also have a quite interesting background growing up with an artist mom and surrounded by the artist. And also the time when you're establishing your business, even when you're running a gallery, that's also the time when the galleries and art advisory, the community was just growing. I wonder if ever, if somebody out there wanted to copy the business model, do you think nowadays with the information, there's so much new technology available, do you see yourself facing tougher competition compared to not even 30 years ago, the day one, maybe your 10th anniversary or 20th anniversary? What's the situation like right now compared to back then?
A client of mine ran one of the top tech companies in the world and a very profitable one and certainly page one kind of thing. And he said, I wake up every morning and I worry that we'll be obsolete. I thought that that was really a brilliant thing that he said. So I have to wake up every morning and worry, will the Baer Faxt newsletter be obsolete? Certainly the competition, of which there was none, is all over the place. So how do we compete with all the different news sites and news outlets that are either free or charging? And it's like, we can't stay the same and expect to not become irrelevant, or you have to make the change before you are irrelevant. So our strength and the core of this news and being inside, again, that's our strength, but that's our weakness. So I think we as a company have to and are, in fact, looking ahead because it's not what things were 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's a challenge. I mean, you talk about a business model. You work with us. You come from that world. You probably see our business model. I don't even know what a business model is supposed to look like. I just know how to do business.
As we always say, there's, right time, right place with right people and the right business. Even before I met you, I just thought that the Baer Faxt itself is a very unique position. And especially it is under one person. And that will be my next question. And which point, as you were just saying, like in order to stay competitive, even though you have that very unique advantage for all the competition, but at some point when you are looking forward, you feel it's the right time to change.
Let me comment at an idea about change that goes back to part of what you asked before and part of where I think we can go. When we talk about the Baer Faxt, it's kind of an art market thing. And it's true, I was a dealer. My real experience from being a dealer and growing up is being around artists. And I grew up around artists. And my actual real insight into the art world may not seem it is understanding the position of the artist. And again, that's something that most journalists don't have. They weren't raised by artists. They didn't understand how it felt from their side. They certainly didn't represent their careers. And 30 years ago, I stopped working with artists. And believe me, that was a relief because that's hard. But about 5 years ago, I had a really horrible realization to myself. It's like, I'm kind of interested in helping artists again. It's like, what's wrong with me? Why do I have that? It's like, okay, I'm old. So I've started a couple of times, quietly or not quietly, advising artists, not for business, but just for knowledge. And I think one of the pivots that we've been making within the newsletter is to more frequently try to tell things from the artist's vantage point too. So whether it was Takashi Murakami answering something or some artist in the Baer Faxt asked, or podcasts that you're doing with artists, it's like trying to also force them as artists, as an audience, they better know what we're doing. and we need a clearer idea of what they're doing. So that's kind of an intuitive pivot that happened 5 years ago. And I think that's something that over the next 10 years that hopefully will provide more and more in a unique way.
One of the things I found very fascinating when I first started working with you, and as you know, I have some artist friends and I buy art and I love talking to my artist friends. And most of them, I always feel like they feel hesitated talking about art business. And because they feel like, I wanted to be an artist or business is something I don't feel comfortable to get into. But ever since we introduced our podcast, I got so many artist friends telling me how much they appreciate listening to the art world's voice through our podcast because it helps them to think about their careers. I wonder what you think about those comments related to what you were thinking about, what you wanted to do something, work with your artists.
I think it relates a little bit to our social media too, trying to a bigger audience of less successful artists, trying to give them a little bit of insight because you're talking to probably mostly somewhat successful artists, if not successful artists. Well, I'm well known for having worked with Amawako Boafo for a few months from when he was still in Vienna with his studio at an art school to within a few months, the Rubel collection and Larry Gagosian or whoever, all the major dealers in the world calling me, trying to get him in the gallery. So it started with that moment when I realized he was really talented. There have been a couple of other artists that people don't know that I've been to their studios or have approached me like, have an independent voice about what's going on in the business. So what we're trying to give is an independent voice that we're not a gallery, we're not an auction house. I don't even want to buy their work because I don't want to misuse the relationship. And just listen, I've spent 64 years in this business. It's like, I've probably seen every kind of thing that's happened. Doesn't mean I can control it. Doesn't mean you can come to me and say, I'm an artist, make me a superstar. I don't know how to do that. But I know how to advise you on like what you should know. And it's always seemed a mystery why, if you're an artist, the collector knows what's going on, the museum curator knows what's going on, the gallery knows what's going on, how things work, and you don't. Then just automatically puts you at a disadvantage. And as you're somewhat fungible to them, dealer can find another artist, museum will do another show. You only have one shot at it. You better take care of yourself. And if we can help you ask the right questions or articulate some examples of artists who've done the right thing or thinking in ways that other artists can relate to, that's valuable. And value in this business isn't always with a dollar sign. I say that we're about knowledge. So if we can show knowledge that doesn't have always commercial thing, it's valuable.
That brings us to the end of part 1 of our Baer With Me special episode celebrating 30 years of the Baer Faxt. We have explored how it all began, the inspiration, the early days, and how a simple idea grew into a trusted resource for the art world. In part 2, we're going to shift the focus to pivotal moments, challenges, and lessons learned along the way. We will also dive into some big questions, like advice for artists and collectors navigating paths beyond the mainstream market. There's so much more to uncover, so thank you for being with us, and we'll see you in part 2. Thank you for listening to Baer With Me, a mini-series of the Baer Faxt podcast. I'm your host and executive producer, Luyang Jiang. Our content strategist is Boiliang Shen. Our associate editor is Patrick Hill, and our audio editor is Auntie Lang. If you have any art world topics you would like to hear on our show, or if you have suggestions for guests, please send us an email at info@thebaerfaxt.com or DM us on Instagram.